Okay, welcome to episode 2 of Pure TokyoScope, coming to you direct from the Big Mekon.
The Big Mekon. Is it called that? That's interesting.
That's what they used to call it that on Tokyo Eye. I don't know if did people used to call it that or
The Big Natto? That's what I call it.
well, it feels like it's been a little smaller lately because there haven't really been a lot of tourists since this whole crazy pandemic thing. And
Interesting you bring that up because there was just an article in the newspaper today talking about how they're going to relax all the restrictions starting early next month in June and start letting tourists in.
yes, but not like all at once. They're not going to like just throw down the red carpet. I mean, I feel like half the people listening to our show are like pacing around angrily, like in a boarding area at an airport, going, "When are they going to let us on the plane? When are we coming back?"
I get a mail about once a week from somebody like, I booked a trip. I canceled a trip. I booked a trip. Like people really, really, really want to come out here.
And we miss seeing everyone. We miss hanging out with y'all, and going to maid cafes, and all those places are closed now. Though, unfortunately, when you come back, it won't be quite the same Tokyo as you remember.
The robot restaurant is gone. It's totally gone. It's been replaced with a normal strip club. How depressing is that?
And was it the Kawaii Monster Cafe is now like a kaiten sushi restaurant?
Oh wow, that's how the mighty cuddly have fallen.
And what the Sega arcades in Akihabara are all what now? They've all been rebranded.
Just to recap what it's like going in and out of Japan right now for people who might not be aware of it. Like basically no tourists are allowed, and even if you do happen to have a valid visa or a permanent resident, you have to, or are Japanese, you have to jump through all of these crazy hoops. Like you have to get tested 72 hours before you come back to Japan. You have to get tested at the airport. You have to sit and wait until they let you out of customs, until the results come through. And it all kind of conspires to make international travel even crazier and more hectic than it usually is.
And they're not just normal tests. They're like you have to build like an expert level Gundam kit like in like 2 minutes or less or something like that.
And if you don't like customize and weather it exactly right, they don't let you in the country. They actually put you in jail forever. So it's been a real problem. It's been an incredible pain in the ass. I traveled to the States last month in April, and like I got denied boarding on the flight to America the first time because of a quirk in the paperwork. And then I finally made it over there, and I finally dodged COVID somehow because everybody stopped wearing masks in the middle of my trip. And then I came back. I had to take all these different tests, and it was just it's already stressful. I know these are first world problems. We have the miracle of airplanes that ferry us back and forth instead of having to take like, I don't know, steamships like Admiral Perry did back in the 1800s. But it's still, I don't know. I'm looking forward to things going back to normal a little bit, but also people here are kind of freaked out about things going back to normal too. Are you picking that up?
I am picking that all up. Here's the official news story. It says Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said on Thursday that foreign tourists will be allowed to enter Japan on package tours from June 10th, paving the way for the full resumption of inbound tourism, which has been suspended for more than 2 years since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Package tours.
Yeah, package tours. Isn't that like when they like send people to North Korea and like you have these guided tours, or like when they reopen authoritarian regimes? Is it like that?
Or is it like Gilligan's Island where it's like a 3-hour tour, but then like you wind up stranded somewhere? It's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy to imagine like a guided tour in Japan. Like there's I can't think of a city where that would be like less necessary than here. Like it's safe, it's clean, like there's public transportation. But of course, the chaperoning is to make sure that ostensibly infected people don't go off and like cause another plague here, I guess.
Yeah, it sounds like the package tours are not necessarily Tokyo. They're sending they did like some kind of dog and pony show initial guided tours earlier this week on Tuesday, and they had people from the US, Thailand, and Singapore. And NHK World did this story on 4 Australians who visited Kanazawa, and it was Mad Max, Kylie Minogue, someone from InXS, and I need one more Australian to complete this joke.
Crocodile Dundee.
Okay, it was Crocodile Dundee. 4 people from Australia walked around Kanazawa, and they had like 2 guides with them. They're all wearing their masks, and it just looked really bizarre and like not a lot of fun. But I could be wrong. Maybe they found a real good tempura somewhere.
Why don't we start? We should start a package tour to Nakano Broadway. Like you just go directly from the airplane to Nakano Broadway. You stay in there for a week.
This is crazy because the first time I came to Tokyo, the guys I were with were such otaku animals that they went straight to Nakano Broadway direct from the airport. Like I got thrown in the deep end.
Oh, I have friends who've literally got Airbnbs in or around Nakano Broadway so they could like max their time out, from noon to 8. Those are the hours, if you, they're probably like hanging out eating their bentos 11:45 in the morning waiting for the gates to open. It's the dream is real, Patrick. You can live that life here. But on a serious note, because you know me, I'm always serious. I think that even though it's cool that we're going to be able to see, our friends and have food, folks, and fun again, there's like a lot of people who are really nervous about the idea of letting tourists back in. Not only because places here were so over touristed before the lockdowns. I mean, like Kyoto was like virtually unnavigable. We were like cheek to jowl with tourists on like in the major thoroughfares. And then there's also a lot of concerns that people, especially coming from America, are going to be really performatively like not wearing their masks and stuff like that. So it's going to be interesting to see if once the borders open and cases inevitably are going to go up. I mean, just because they are, because more people are going to be coming from different parts of the world, if that's going to result in any kind of, I don't know, bad vibes.
Pre-pandemic, there were 40 million annual visitors to Japan. The Japanese government is obsessed with hitting 60 million annual tourists by 2030.
It's a small country. Perhaps you've noticed it's not exactly like the largest, most luxurious country out there, and it's kind of wild that so much effort is being put into bringing more tourists in. I mean, literally, big tourist places like Asakusa and Tokyo are just mobbed or were mobbed. And it's actually been, one of the kind of silver linings of this horrible, pandemic has been that people who live in Japan can actually get to some of these tourist places and enjoy them like they used to be years before tourism really took off. So it's going to be interesting to see. It's going to be a big shift when people finally start coming back in.
Yeah, but I mean, the first step is like these wacky package tours starting on June 10th, and it's going to be really small scale. They're going to, I guess, scale up probably like once a month or something like that. The details in classic Japanese fashion are a bit vague and ill-defined, but there is a plan out there somewhere. So if anyone wants to go to a package tour to some remote corner of Japan and get shuttled around from one desirable location to the next, if not necessarily straight to Nakano Broadway, then I don't know. Come on over, I guess.
What are the nations? I think America, Canada. I know Korea and China are on that list. Are European countries?
They want to be reciprocal with the whole G7 because I guess Japanese people can travel to G7 countries. So the group of Ultra 7.
I thought G7 said gotcha, man.
Yeah, I don't know. The rules keep changing. They keep making announcements. I think it sounds like they're waiting until after the elections here in July to then make sweeping changes that will radically impact everything.
That was the big kind of speculation. But, things are changing so rapidly here. I guarantee you by the episode 3, there's going to be a completely different take and completely different news on this. It's a fluid situation, Patrick. We'll be recording from the ground here in Tokyo.
So after this commercial break, we will go on to our feature segment.
Now you can defend Earth in your own home with the Robotech Wars video set.
Robotech to the rescue.
With a specially created 60-minute Robotech Wars videotape, you can fight right along with the Robotech Defense Force.
Battlepods attacking! Send in Rick Hunter and the Veritech Fighter!
Robotech to the rescue.
Robotech Wars video cassette comes with Veritech Fighter and Battlepod, new from Matchbox.
Robotech won!
Wait till Mars Base.
It was like somebody like, make Robotech toys. Like didn't even bother watching the show. I missed that era of everything's so realistic now,
Okay, so for our feature this week, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about Matt's book,
Pure Invention: How Japan Made the Modern World. And it came out on paperback in 2021. Hardback in 2020.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about the book because it really does an amazing job of kind of summing pretty much up all these various tangential threads surrounding Japanese pop culture, connecting the dots between things like kawaii, emoji, video games, anime, and the increasing disruptive things from the internet and image board culture and stuff like that. But how would you describe the book? Like, what is the elevator pitch?
Right. So, well, as a writer in Japanese pop culture yourself, you know that there's a lot of really great books out there that deal with like anime or deal with music or deal with fashion. But, you know, I realized there wasn't really any book that or analysis that tried to capture the big picture of why Japan has this like cultural pull and cultural gravity on the entire world. Because, you know, it's very rare that you're going to have somebody who's like super into anime but doesn't know anything about Hello Kitty or like video games or anything. They're all kind of like facets of this much bigger you know, jewel, as it were, that is, you know, Japanese pop culture's, you know, and pop cultural charisma. So that's was my kind of thinking when I went into wanting to write this book. I wanted to kind of quantify the big picture of why we love Japan, not just kind of those individual little threads, even as cool as they are to explore.
So, I mean, looking back at the book, which I read about 2 years ago, I think I read it just before publication. So I've kind of had some time to sit back and reflect on it and watch kind of how things have evolved or de-evolved in some cases after the book has come out. Now that you have some perspective on it, the book is chock full of interviews with people who made the stuff that kind of changed our lives and sort of changed the world. Like, what were some of the craziest interviews or like people you couldn't believe you got to talk on record?
The book started kind of as this cultural detective story where I wanted to actually track down the kind of first iterations of all of this stuff. The first like kawaii product, the first karaoke machine, the first, you know, really popular home video game system or what have you. And one of the greatest interviews I did in the book was I actually managed to find the guy who created the world's first karaoke machine. And he's like in his 90s, he lives in Tokyo, and he made it and didn't quite he made it in 1967, and he tried selling it for a couple years, but like it was a little bit too early, and so his, you know, company went out of business and he was kind of forgotten. But, you know, he remains in karaoke history. And so I managed to track him down, and it was just really amazing talking to this guy who's, you know, basically twice my age, and putting together like all of these little threads that had nothing to do with karaoke, but ran all throughout Japanese pop culture through talking to this guy. Like, for instance, his daughter and his son, who are now our age, they're like in their late 40s, they were talking about how when dad brought home this prototype karaoke machine, that they were all playing with like kaiju toys on the floor and stuff like that, because it was in the middle of like the 1967 kaiju boom. And, you know, the guy who created the karaoke machine, before he did that, he was like involved in trying to license like Tetsuan Atom Astro Boy characters from, you know, Tezuka Productions and make like licensed products that way. He was doing all sorts of entrepreneurial stuff. So it really drove home how like all of this stuff is connected. There's not just, it just doesn't exist in a vacuum. And he was really cool to find and talk to.
One thing that struck out to me from the text of the book was how many of these like fabulous Japanese inventions that changed the world and have given, you know, billions of people so much pleasure initially started out as like things that were viewed in Japan as like dangerous or disruptive, like Space Invaders. Even karaoke was seen as a bit of a social menace. And of course, anime is the biggest menace of all.
You know, one of the big takeaways that when I was writing the book, and I hadn't like, it's obvious in retrospect, but I hadn't really realized it until I started talking to these people and putting it down, is that none of the stuff we love about Japan was made for us. Like none of it. It was all made for Japanese people first and foremost. And then like selling it abroad was a totally secondary thing. Like even like huge stuff like the Nintendo Entertainment System, like when that was initially made, nobody thought about selling it abroad. It was only after like the president of Nintendo, who thought that like toy fads would run out after 3 years, figured, oh, well, 3 years are up. Let's just try selling it to the Americans now. That's crazy, because we think of so much of Japanese pop culture as being global phenomena now, but like it was all made just for Japanese people. But then again, I guess that's kind of what gives it its authenticity. That's like another thing that we love about stuff from Japan, right?
So when some of those like early innovative Japanese products first hit the market in Japan, there was a lot of resistance, both from some segments of society and also, you know, internally within companies not really believing these things had a lot of potential, even within Japan or outside of Japan. But then when some of these things get to America, there's a big pushback because of Japan bashing, or people want video games to be American, or they want animation to stay American, and that they look down on these like kind of invading things from Japan. So there's all these kind of gatekeepers who are sort of trying to throw up their arms and block the flow of pop culture.
Yeah, one of the funniest moments to me is like Pokemania in America in like the late 1990s, where like American parents in particular think that like Japan is targeting their children deliberately with the success of Pokemon. And it's like there's no realization at all that Pokemon was a complete lark in Japan. Nobody expected it to take off there. They weren't even expecting to localize it and sell it in America at first. Like Miyamoto Shigeru, who's like, the genius who came up with like Super Mario and like so many other classic Nintendo characters, Zelda. He was like, yeah, I was told by the higher ups that there was no expectations that a product like this could sell abroad. And now we know, of course, Pokemon is like probably the single greatest pop cultural export of Japan in the last 50 years or more. But at the time, nobody knew that. And so when it arrived in America, first it hits in Japan, like totally word of mouth. And, the Japanese media machine is fast. So they're like, okay, it's hitting among kids. Let's make a cartoon. Let's make a comic book. Let's make cards. All of that stuff arrived at once in America. So it seemed like it was this kind of like invasive beachhead that like Japanese creators were making to like steal the hearts and souls of American kids. But it was just a factor of how it had been honed in Japan for Japanese kids.
You don't think Riki Takeuchi is the greatest pop cultural export from Japan?
I was going to say the Sukiyaki song. I thought that was the greatest export of the last 50 years. Actually, that's probably more than 50 years ago now. I think it's like 70.
Big picture questions I have that lingered in my mind for the last couple of years after reading this book is, what do you think led to so much gosh darn innovation in Japan during that post-war hot streak before the bubble burst?
Right. So like the big takeaway from the book is that like one of the big reasons that we love stuff from Japan isn't because like things like anime and manga and like toys or karaoke machines or the Walkman are well made. They are well made. But the real reason we love this stuff is because it answered questions for the Japanese marketplace that were happening there before they happened in the West. Because like Japan like urbanized way faster than we did. Japan got like to its like middle class like phase really quick. And like you had this like highly urbanized group of people who were just hungry for like new forms of leisure. And then their economy blows up. And suddenly you have this entire class of young people who feel like totally abandoned by adults. They can't get jobs. Is this sounding familiar? They can't like launch their lives. They can't launch their careers. They can't start families. And so Japan of the 1990s looks a lot like America of now. And so it's why all of these products that were made for these people back then seemed so like far-fetched and futuristic and amazing. It's because they were, because Japan had gotten to the future a little bit ahead of us, but not necessarily in this Jetsons way, in this kind of late capitalist, post-industrial hellscape kind of way. So, thanks to that, if you want to use the word thanks, like Japan was able to create all of these things for its own citizens that turned out to like deeply appeal to all of us who are about to go into these kind of, troubling times ourselves.
Matt, do you think Japan is still innovating?
Well, they are in the sense they're kind of deteriorating, and in the same way that the entire planet is. They're aging faster, right? There's less vitality here now and stuff. But, I argue this in the book. Like, I don't think the future is going to be made in Japan anymore. Like it was like, remember when we're growing up and like all the politicians are like, the future is going to be made in Japan. We got to stop this kind of thing. And that's not going to be the case. And it did seem that way because like, all of the cool stuff was coming out of Japan, all the computers and like, gadgets and games and like pocket monsters and stuff. But I don't think that's the case anymore. But we've all absorbed so much from Japan. Like it would be a rare Hollywood movie maker who hasn't seen a ton of anime these days, for instance. And that's just one example. We've all absorbed so much stuff from Japan that we're going to start to see the world made everywhere else with these kind of sensibilities that we've borrowed from Japan or that we've absorbed, instinctually. So, and you see that a lot in the video game world. There's so many games out there, like Genshin Impact that are obviously like hugely influenced by Japan and stuff. Or like how many kids out there in America like want to become manga artists now? It's wild. I mean, it's just, When we were kids, it was tough to find this stuff, remember?
I mean, there was Fred Schott's book Manga, and I used to just cling to that, like just reading it over and over, reading the same manga excerpts over and over and over again because that was as much manga as I was ever going to get.
Yeah, that was like literally the only way to read Tezuka, Osamu Tezuka back then, or like Matsumoto Reiji in English, his excerpts in there. Now, like, you can like stream this stuff on the Jump, streaming app or whatever it is, in real time on your computer without even leaving your house. So it's a sea change. And this isn't some kind of like when I was your age kind of thing. Like if I was a millennial or zillennial now, I would be in heaven.
Or you might be in hell in what you call the antisocial network, is the last chapter of the book, which kind of dives into image board culture. And maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
People were a lot of readers were like really shocked, and some were even upset that I'd linked like Japanese pop culture to like 4chan and that whole morass of like problems. But a lot of people aren't also aware of the fact that 4chan was founded as a anime fandom board. It was literally founded by anime fans for anime fans to trade their favorite bootlegs and like talk about stuff. It was kind of like an anime convention in real time. This is back in 2003 when it started. Of course, now it is mutated into something much different, much worse, arguably very scary. But, we're seeing all sorts of revelations about how 4chan has influenced these terrible things that have happened in American culture politically, like terror, all sorts of really, really bad stuff. But its roots were in the appreciation of Japanese pop culture. And now just today, Wired Magazine published this wild, a story that very convincingly alleges that 4chan is actually being bankrolled by a bunch of Japanese pop cultural companies. So these kind of like pop cultural flows that go back and forth between the US and Japan aren't necessarily all like wonderful things. Like it's really cool that we can all cosplay now. It's really cool that we can all like appreciate, art from other lands so easily, but they also can feed into like negative subcultures and things like that too. And I thought that was a really important point to make in the book. This isn't all about like, rainbows and unicorns and, completing your, Pokedex. There's also some kind of negative aspects to, extreme fandom and stuff like that. And, we see it every day on the internet.
Yeah, it's a bit spooky. I mean, there's almost like two sides of this coin. One is that there are gatekeepers who try to halt the flow of pop culture, and then there's this chaos, and there's just like no more gatekeepers. There's just like an image board culture where anything can happen, and it usually does.
Yeah, I mean, well, arguably, the net is pop culture now, and you can actually pretty convincingly, especially in the United States, make the argument that the net is culture. Like it's not even pop culture; it's mainstream culture. Like. You have situations where a tweet can suddenly be on like the nightly news and it becomes like a huge scandal or political scandal. Like that's really wild to me. We didn't have anything like that when we were growing up as kids. We didn't see these kind of information flows happening in real time. And as they've become so, I don't know, sped up and weirder, it's like pop culture is becoming our lives in a really weird way. Like, toxic fans or like, not even toxic stands, like K-pop stands who are like disrupting like Donald Trump rallies and things like that, or like anime fans who are protesting for democracy in Hong Kong and like Thailand and places like that. It's not just entertainment anymore. It's like the things that we consume have become more than even our identities. They're like tools for struggle, and we're all struggling. I know I sure am. It's pretty weird out there these days.
I'm struggling because there is no letterboxed copy of Final Yamato in its original aspect ratio. That's been a big problem of mine for about, 30 years now.
And I've been struggling with the fact I haven't been able to complete my original collection of Gundam models, unbuilt, still mint in box. But it's funny. We were really ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. I mean, you and I, like, when we were kids, you kind of had to hide the fact you were into things like, comic books and anime and things like that. But now it's like everybody's into them. It's literally, and that's a good thing. This isn't some kind of me trying to gatekeep. I was into it before it was cool. It's like we're all otaku now in a lot of ways. I think you can say. Are you an otaku, Patrick? I like to think of you as one.
Maybe. Otaku about otaku. That's like my that's my answer that I give whenever I
Yes.
have to go on record. But the book has been published in Japanese since we last talked about it, and I'm curious what the reaction has been in Japan to Pure Invention.
Like Japanese people are just completely blown away by it. They're like, "What? Like our content had this much of an impact abroad?" I don't think people because this stuff is all made for people in Japan, they don't really think about it being consumed abroad except when there's like some kind of huge high point like, Hayao Miyazaki winning the, Palme d'Or or something like that, or, Drive My Car winning at an Academy Award or something like that. Most of the time, Japanese people don't really think about the outside world a lot, and they tend to think of themselves as this tiny island nation devoid of resources who is not of particular interest to anyone but themselves. So there was a lot of shock at seeing how something like the karaoke machine could have laid the foundations for like influencer culture or something like that, which I talk about in the book. So just shock, like huge shock. And I was interviewed about it a bunch of times in Japanese like papers and media and stuff like that. It was really really cool to see the people who I'd interviewed get to like read the book in Japanese. I was really happy about that.
Okay, so Matt, I have I have two questions for you. One, is it true you made it all up? And what did you want to put in the book that you couldn't?
So you know how it goes, right? Like, when you start researching something like this, you want to put everything in, but then like stuff inevitably kind of can't make it in for whatever reason. One of the big things I wanted to put in was like about the Power Rangers. I tracked down this guy named Gene Pelk, who still lives here in Japan, and he was kind of like Stan Lee and Marvel Comics' man in Japan in the 70s. He brokered all of the deals for like Spider-Man and like Miss Marvel, which turned into Battle Fever J. And he arguably is like responsible for rejuvenating that whole kind of Super Sentai scene that gave rise to the Power Rangers many decades later. But that was a whole really interesting story about how, we think of the Power Rangers as like Japanese, but they're actually kind of like really the proto Marvel universe in a way. Like they really paved the way for how like the MCU and all of that would take off in the 21st century. And I was sad I didn't have time and space to put that in.
Did he have any stories about like the Red Ranger getting arrested or anything like that?
No, but actually his son was sitting in on the interviews, and his son was telling me how he like worked as an extra in those old like, Toei live action shows as like a kid, like in the background or something like that. And like the stories of like, what he witnessed of like the stuntmen were basically just being like thrown through windows and stuff like that. And like the injury levels on set were absolutely crazy in the 70s. That's all like Japan Action Club, it's like Sonny Chiba's company and like people like that are they were doing all the outsourcing for the stunt work in those shows.
The good old days. Yeah, I think at some point in the future, we're going to do an episode on filmmaking in the 1970s. We might have a special guest kind of give us some inside scoops on what it was like being on the Toei Gaijin bus, I believe is what it was called.
Yes, he told us there was a bus that used to drive around downtown like looking for foreign people that they could just use as extras and see. I like to think that bus is still driving around today.
It's like the Mary Celeste. It just appears out of like, it's a ghostly ship from some distant past that escorts people away to like Toei action movies and like erotic thrillers and stuff like that.
One can dream.
Okay, so I think that wraps it up for our second episode. Want to thank everyone for listening. Thanks for your support for the first show. Next episode next week, it's the podcast about my book, Matt. My book. What about my book? TokyoScope, the Japanese cult film companion.
I better read it so I can ask some questions. I have one question, Patrick. One big question about your book. Is it real?
No, I made it all up, Matt. Is this real?
That's the way of the world these days.
Is this surreal? Okay, thanks everyone for listening. We'll catch you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.